One quiet evening, a man boarded a flight like any other passenger. He wore a simple jacket, carried one small bag, and took his seat without drawing attention. But within minutes, whispers began to spread through the cabin. A flight attendant looked at him twice. Another crew member made a call. Then suddenly, everything changed. Passengers watched in stunned silence as the man was ordered to stand up and escorted off the plane. No explanation. No apology. Just a quiet humiliation in front of hundreds of strangers. What no one on that aircraft realized was that the man they had just removed wasn't a threat, a criminal, or a troublemaker. He was the CEO of a billion-dollar company. And by the next morning, the airline that forced him off that plane would face a consequence no one could have imagined. But the real question is this: was it just a mistake or something far deeper that still affects countless lives today? Marcus Ellison had spent years building a life defined by discipline, quiet determination, and long hours most people would never see. As the CEO of a fast-growing technology company, his days were filled with board meetings, investor calls, and decisions that affected thousands of employees. But despite the title and the success, Marcus never carried himself like a man trying to prove anything. To most people who knew him, he was calm, thoughtful, and intensely focused on his work. He believed in solving problems quietly, letting results speak louder than status. That evening, Marcus was simply trying to get home after a demanding week of meetings. The airport was crowded, buzzing with the usual rhythm of announcements, rolling suitcases, and tired travelers searching for their gates. Nothing about the moment felt unusual. He checked in, passed through security, and boarded the plane like everyone else. He wore a plain jacket, carried a small laptop bag, and took his assigned seat without drawing attention. To the other passengers, he was just another traveler hoping for a quiet flight. But somewhere between the crew preparing for takeoff and the final passengers settling in, something shifted. A flight attendant paused near his row longer than necessary. Another crew member glanced over, whispering something before walking away. Marcus noticed the looks but brushed them off. He had experienced moments like that before. Moments where people made quick judgments before knowing who he was. Still, he never expected what would happen next. Because within minutes, the calm routine of boarding would turn into something far more uncomfortable and far more public than anyone on that plane could have imagined. The cabin doors were nearly closed when the tension around Marcus began to feel impossible to ignore. At first, it was just quiet glances. A flight attendant passed his row once, then again. Each time, her eyes lingered a little longer. Another crew member appeared beside her, whispering something while subtly pointing in Marcus's direction. A few nearby passengers began to notice. Marcus shifted slightly in his seat, pretending not to see it. Years of experience had taught him something important. Sometimes the safest thing to do was remain calm and let moments like this pass. But this time it didn't pass. A third crew member approached. He stood in the aisle beside Marcus's seat, forcing a polite but strained smile. For a moment he didn't speak. He simply looked Marcus up and down as if trying to confirm something in his mind. Then he quietly asked Marcus to step into the aisle. Several passengers turned their heads. The soft hum of conversations around them began to fade as curiosity spread through the cabin. Marcus calmly stood up. He asked if there was a problem. The crew member avoided the question. Instead, he said there had been a situation and they needed Marcus to come with them for a moment. A situation. The word hung in the air like an accusation without details. Marcus glanced around, confused. He had boarded normally. His ticket was valid. His seat assignment was correct. Nothing about this made sense. Still, he followed them toward the front of the plane. That's when the whispering started. Some passengers assumed the worst. A few pulled out their phones, quietly recording. Others watched with the uneasy curiosity people often have when they think they are witnessing trouble. At the front of the aircraft, 2 more airline staff members were waiting. Their expressions were tense. One of them spoke in a low voice, explaining that there had been a concern raised about Marcus's presence on the flight. But they couldn't explain what the concern actually was. No accusation. No evidence. Just discomfort. Marcus felt the familiar knot forming in his chest. A feeling he had known since he was young, that moment when someone looks at you and decides you don't belong before you even speak. He asked again what the problem was. This time the answer was even shorter. The airline had decided he would need to leave the plane. For a moment Marcus thought he had misheard. The plane was full. Passengers were seated. The flight was preparing for departure. And yet somehow he was the one being asked to leave. A quiet wave of murmurs spread through the nearby rows as word began to travel. People craned their necks, trying to understand what was happening. Marcus stood there, surrounded by airline staff, feeling every pair of eyes slowly turning toward him. Part of him wanted to argue. Part of him wanted to demand answers. But another part of him knew something many people in that moment didn't. Situations like this could spiral quickly. And sometimes the smartest move was simply to walk away. So Marcus picked up his bag. Without raising his voice, without creating a scene, he stepped off the plane. Behind him, the cabin doors finally closed. The flight attendants returned to their positions. Passengers whispered about the mysterious removal of the quiet man from seat 14C. And within minutes, the plane pushed back from the gate as if nothing unusual had happened. But what the airline didn't realize was that the man they had just removed wasn't powerless. And by the time the sun rose the next morning, this quiet moment of humiliation would explode into something the entire country was about to see. By the time Marcus stepped into the terminal, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. He stood there for a moment, watching through the wide airport windows as the aircraft slowly pushed back from the gate. The same plane he had legally boarded. The same seat he had paid for. Now leaving without him. Around him, a few passengers who had been waiting at nearby gates were whispering. Some had seen what happened. One person had recorded the moment Marcus was escorted off the plane. Marcus checked his phone. Messages from colleagues were already waiting, questions about the next morning's investor meeting. A meeting that could shape the future of his company. And suddenly the humiliation hit harder. Not because he had been removed from a flight, but because of the quiet message behind it. In a crowded plane full of travelers, staff had looked at him and decided he was the problem. Marcus took a slow breath and opened the video someone had already sent him. The footage was shaky, filmed from a passenger's seat a few rows back. It showed Marcus calmly standing while airline staff surrounded him. No argument. No explanation. Just the quiet removal of one passenger while everyone else watched. Within seconds, the comments below the video were already exploding. Why him? He didn't even do anything. Why does this keep happening? Marcus stared at the screen. For years, he had worked to build a company worth billions. He had negotiated deals across continents, led thousands of employees, and earned respect in boardrooms where few people looked like him. Yet in that moment, none of it mattered. To the airline staff, he wasn't a CEO. He was simply someone who didn't belong. But what the airline didn't know, what they couldn't see in that quiet moment of humiliation, was that the story was no longer confined to that aircraft. Because while that plane was now somewhere in the sky, the video of what happened inside it had already begun spreading across the internet. And by morning, the entire world would be watching. By the next morning, the story was everywhere. The shaky video filmed by a passenger had spread across social media overnight. Millions of people were watching the same moment again and again, the quiet man in seat 14C calmly standing as airline staff surrounded him and escorted him off the plane. News stations picked it up within hours. At first, reporters focused on the question everyone was asking, why was he removed? But the story took a dramatic turn when Marcus Ellison's identity became public. The man who had been quietly humiliated in front of an entire plane wasn't just another passenger. He was the CEO of one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the country. And suddenly, the conversation exploded. Investors began questioning the airline's actions. Civil rights groups demanded answers. Thousands of people shared their own stories, moments when they too had been treated like they didn't belong. By midday, the airline released a statement. Then another. Then another. But the damage was already done. Within 24 hours, the company's stock had taken a massive hit. Billions in market value vanished as public outrage grew and sponsors began distancing themselves. But for Marcus, the moment wasn't about revenge or financial consequences. It was about something deeper. Because the truth was painfully simple. If this could happen to a man who led a billion-dollar company, what happened to people who didn't have cameras recording or headlines exposing the truth? Marcus eventually spoke publicly about the incident. Not with anger, but with clarity. He reminded people that racism rarely announces itself loudly. Sometimes it appears quietly in suspicious glances, in silent assumptions, in decisions made without explanation. Moments that seem small until they're exposed for the world to see. The flight eventually reached its destination. Passengers went on with their lives. But the video of what happened inside that cabin left behind a question millions of people couldn't ignore. If the world hadn't been watching, would anyone have cared at all?